Good morning, Hildur. Hi, how are you? So glad to be here for your environment now, and you are the person to go ahead and bring it to us. So good morning, good morning. I see your background there. It's really very lovely this morning. It's very different than what we had before. Where are you?
Well, I am back at Soul Center. So I'm happy to share that I have access again to the building. I'm not meeting people in person, but conducting any live streaming or sessions from here.
Oh, great, great, great. And for the benefit of those who don't know you very well, maybe you can give us a little bit of background about, what is Soul Center and what's your background and why are you doing your environment now? What's that? What does it mean to you?
Yes, it really means the world to me. I teach mindfulness meditation, so I breathe for a living, like most of us. And I like to really take care of the natural world, the living world, with which I breathe. So like you, Keith, I offer mindfulness meditation instruction in private and to groups. And it really drives my work in the world in terms of environmental education and conservation efforts.
Right, but you're so much more. I mean, you're involved with Soul Center, you're involved with Rewild, you're involved with the Child Science Museum. You're doing so much more in the community, and it's really a blessing to have you around to talk about the environment. And I'm excited specifically about today because we're going to be talking about a number of things that are pretty current. What are we going to talk about today?
We are going to be talking about the coronavirus crisis as it relates to the climate crisis. I've been working as an activist, environmental activist and educator for about a decade now. And for us working in the field, this time was expected. And it's important that we educate the public on prevention. Future is in our hands. The future is really, truly in our hands. And we can start today making these connections that are evident to anyone who's working in this field. So I want to start with a short video of what's happening in the world right now. We are sheltering in place while wild animals are roaming around. Coyote seen there in San Francisco, and there we have deer in Paris. Dolphins are having a terrific time. There is a noticeable difference in air purity and water quality. Goats are looking wild and free, and then a puma shows up in Santiago, Chile.
I love that. That's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah, so I really love this video because wildlife is confused as as humans have taken shelter, and they seem like they're having a good time. I heard that bears in Yosemite are truly having a party. The next video went on automatically. Apologies. But first, hi everyone who's here. Welcome. I'm going to be sharing my screen again. as we move on to the presentation. YouTube channel has a way of just going ahead, and yeah, that's all right. That's the benefit of being in the grassroots business. We're pretty relaxed about things. So you're seeing my screen again, right?
Not yet, but I know it's coming up here, Hildur. There it is. Okay, good. We got it.
So we're going to move on to the presentation for today. The topic that I wanted to make is the link between coronavirus and the climate crisis. But first, I regret that the top stories in the last couple of days have been about the murder hornets. Oh. And the mainstream media felt the need to link them to China. The truth is, it's an Asian hornet. And I had to comfort my children. We're already in fear here, so we don't really need to add to that fear. I just want to make a word of notion in terms of how animals are portrayed, and the fact here is this world's largest wasp has been spotted. I think just a few of the species members, and yes, we must move towards, as we have early detection, fast removal. In this case, it's very unlikely that this wasp will reach us here in New York, basically because of temperature. So it's not, I think I've heard something like, if people east of the Mississippi see something like this, they shouldn't assume that it's a giant Asian hornet. So that's just how I wanted to start today, to put your mind at ease. And did somebody ask a question? Did I miss that? I see that something in the chat.
There was just a note that we were talking about before in terms of murder hornets being a delicacy in Japan, that they skewer them. I mentioned, yes. Yeah. So being the vegetarian that I am, I'm not going to be having one anytime soon. But I understand they're quite tasty.
And the truth is, if we do not want murder hornets here, as they're called in the mainstream media, we should really be working on preventing global warming in any which way we can. These invasive species with increased travel, much like the coronavirus, we see the introduction of invasive species, both plants and animals. And that brings us to the topic of today, COVID-19. Where did it come from? We have here pretty good evidence that mishandling of animals is the reason. And also the fact that humans have been invading wildlife habitats, and that creates this condition where we are exposed to infection. And here's an example of a wet market in Wuhan, where it's suspected that the coronavirus emerged, or in that area. And you can see here the pangolin. It's a truly endearing mammal, and they've been around for 80 million years and really are on the endangered list. But for some reason, illegal poaching and animal trafficking is unrestricted globally. I'm not quite sure why there isn't more of a global regulation in this regard. But you can just see here how the bats are stacked up. Bats happen to have a terrific immune system. And I was talking to a class of children the other day, and they said, well, we should just get rid of the bats. And I said, well, who's going to pollinate the rainforest then? We need the rainforest, right, for breathing. So there important connections have to be made. The way we treat animals will eventually be returned to us. And we are related to the pangolins and to the bats. we share a common ancestor. So we are in fact distant relatives, and viruses can jump between species. And if these poor animals here are stressed out, when you remove the pangolins from their habitat, they refuse to eat and drink, which is why you rarely see them in zoos. You will not see them in captivity. They die slowly on the way to the market. And anyone who's had virus infection knows the most common example is herpes infection that actually came from chimpanzees, I believe. But when we're stressed out, our immune system doesn't work well. And that goes for these animals here. And these stressed out conditions are perfect opportunity for viruses to jump across species. So these practices must simply be stopped. And that is the message I wanted to make today. And pangolins are best kept in their natural habitat. You can see how happy this pangolin is there. And with endangered species, if we show them the simple respect of leaving them be, that may actually be a public health benefit. So I wanted to actually call on David, if David could unmute himself, because he had such a wonderful way to talk about this. He actually mentioned that the more biodiversity we have, the more species, the less disease. And if you could speak to that, David, how the biodiversity crisis, we're in the midst now of the 6th mass extinction, how it actually increases the opportunity for infection.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Hildur.
Can we see David?
I can. And you, me?
I'll stop sharing my screen so we can see you.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So first off, I'd like to define what we mean by biodiversity, and to just describe briefly how many species we have on the planet and how many of them are being endangered by this biodiversity crisis that we speak of. And then what are the factors endangering them? I'd like to just briefly mention that. And then come back to look at the relationship between biodiversity and infectious diseases. So biodiversity is the diversity of life on Earth. It extends from the diversity of biological communities, like a forest or a lake, to the diversity of species, Homo sapiens, Canis familiaris, to the diversity of individuals within a species, the genetic diversity, that helps species to adapt to changing conditions. So there are approximated 7 million species on Earth, 1.2 million identified. I should say approximately, because scientists are out in debate whether there's 10 million or 100 million species, but they project, or rather not project, there's some implications that between 10,000 and 100,000 species are being lost each year. The cause of this is well spelled out in an acronym called HIPPO, and the primary drivers of biodiversity loss are habitat loss, invasive species, which we'll talk about shortly, population growth, pollution, and that includes carbon pollution that drives climate change, and also overharvesting of animals and resources. So if you want to lead on from here, Hildur.
I needed to unmute myself. Yes, so this is interesting because we talked about the best way to get rid of invasives. That was early detection, fast removal, right? In the case of the Asian hornet. And the Asian hornet is a threat to bees, right? And so ecoliteracy here is very important. the more species we have, the healthier our ecosystem, right, David? That's the connection we want to be making. The more species, less disease. Why is that? Because there's a regulation, a natural intelligence in a healthy ecosystem. So here on Long Island, we're very familiar with the tick epidemic, right? So that's a perfect example of what happened with invading an ecosystem, removing important elements in that existing ecosystem. So we removed predators, and disease vectors are then propagated more easily. And David, you wanted to speak to that?
I do, absolutely.
And I had a question as well, David. As a vegan, this is Keith. One of the things I was aware of, there was a University of Oxford study quite a few years ago, back in 2018, that said, and it sort of was highlighted by Hildur's video with all of the animals coming out, and also a recent news report that said that the hole in the ozone layer is closed up recently, which is really wonderful since we don't have as many planes flying and so on, I would imagine. But it said that you could reduce the overall carbon footprint from just going and not eating animals, just reducing your food consumption, your wildlife consumption, all of that area. You could reduce the carbon footprint by about 73%. And I was also wondering if you heard about something similar to that, and this kind of slide that you put up sort of speaks to that. I thought that was wonderful news. So let me be quiet and let you talk.
Certainly. So when we're talking about agriculture and when it comes to domestic livestock, in particular, there's two major drivers of climate change. One is land use change, and the other one is the emission of, in particular, methane from cows belching. And methane's a powerful greenhouse driver. So these two factors together are extremely important in driving climate change.
These are very important connections made. And we must stress the fact that biodiversity protects ecosystems against infectious diseases. And this is new data, right, David?
Yes, so to speak to that, there have been recent studies done, one by Nature actually, that found that as the biodiversity protects ecosystems against infectious diseases, loss of species in the environment has dangerous consequences for the spread of and incidence of infections, including those that affect humans. And there's also a number of ways that this plays out. So, for instance, you mentioned Lyme disease, Hildur. Yes. So, as we develop habitat, as we continue to develop habitat into the wilderness, we are having an effect on the biodiversity around us. Diminishing biodiversity has been shown actually to increase hantavirus in deer mice in the United States. The white-footed mouse is a vector for the Lyme disease. The white-footed mouse, which is very common around human households, is a vector for Lyme disease that they transmit to deer, and then deer ticks transmit that disease to us.
Yes. And I am all about solutions, which is why I think we're aware of the problem. And here we are looking in the rear view window with this red cardinal. I love this picture. Do you see it? It's important for us to understand that we are completely responsible in what type of consumption, what we eat, what we purchase, what type of industry we support as we move towards renewables and a sustainable future. We must take responsibility for how we live in the world and stop hurting for example, the rainforest. We must stop that. And here is a wonderful organization that I volunteer for that is running a campaign called Saving Life on Earth, no less, Center for Biological Diversity. And there's a link here if you want to look at what they do. But they're mobilizing for the wild because the wild doesn't have a voice. So that's a global effort and a way to contribute to sustaining and helping biodiversity. And locally, how do we make a difference? How do we best support local biodiversity? We plant native plants. It's as simple as that. We create habitats for, in this case, local pollinators. And we talked about that. And here's David, the founder of Rewild Long Island, and a wonderful team of volunteers. What we do is we support local insects. We support good best practices. We have Paul here, Paul Myrtleson, who is turning into our compost specialist on site, as we all are figuring out how to live sustainably, how to lower the carbon footprint, how can we support a healthy, thriving ecosystem here, with the notion that everything matters, and advocacy is part of it. That's the reason why we're here today. And I just want to show everyone that rewilding can look really pretty. Here is Anne-Marie with her daughter outside their house. So instead of the lawn, they have phlox that's in bloom right now. It's really inspiring to do the right thing, and it looks beautiful too. It can look beautiful too. And David, I wanted to speak to that. I wanted to move towards solution thinking. Solution thinking means eat less meat or stop animal consumption, right? In order to be an agent of change in this time. Climate crisis per se, like we talked about in the beginning, if we don't do something today, we have to be ready to meet the giant Asian hornet. If we're going to be living in a warming climate, we'll see all sorts of exotic diseases, right, David? It's about 10,000 viruses waiting to meet us.
Yes. So every organism carries with them their own set of viruses. And as we encounter new species in the wild, as we develop, we are exposed to new viruses that increase global communities' vulnerability to infectious diseases and viruses. Also, when it comes to, for example, rewilding, one of the practices that we do is rain gardens. And rain gardens are places where water collects on the ground, runoff or groundwater, and you have a little muddy or you have a depression that's filled with water. These depressions, when they are not planted or have low plant diversity, are a excellent breeding ground for mosquitoes which carry West Nile virus. So rain gardens, rewilding actually helps to support predators that will diminish the populations of these disease-bearing mosquitoes. And so another factor that reduces mosquitoes are bats. As we rewild, we are getting more bats. I also want to touch on, so how is climate change increasing the prevalence of our incidence of our infectious diseases? Well, there's a chain, there's a few links. As we've spoken about, climate change is affecting species on Earth, our biodiversity crisis. And our biodiversity crisis is driving new infectious diseases. And so there's a link there between climate change and biodiversity. And also how we can address the climate change. One of the ways we can do that is to help support those habitats and species that are endangered by climate change.
Yes, exactly. That's such an important point. And that was really the point we wanted to make today, right? And here is also a wonderful website that I wanted to share with our community. Audubon.org has a website, Plants for Birds, where you can actually go in and put in your zip code and see what type of plants would best support birds in this case, but that means the local insect population. I'm going to take the screen share off so we can all have a conversation, as this is intended to be interactive, but David and I tend to get very we tend to get a little bit into the lecture format. So I'd love to open up for discussion and questions, and especially Max, who is very involved here in field work. If anybody has comments, questions, or wants to speak, I'd love to take the back seat and listen in.
Yeah, my question would be for you, Max, and David as well. If we were going to take one step today, one thing today, maybe the most important step that we could do or take, what would you say we could do to go ahead and help our environment, day by day or step by step?
I think that for a lot of people, the most important first step would be maybe to read something about it, or really kind of foster their eco-literacy and get education, because I find that, because I'm a little bit of an environmentalist, and, my parents are fantastic. They love the outdoors, but they're not as tuned into some of the issues that are kind of plaguing the planet at the moment. But once they become educated, they're much more willing to make changes because they can see the problems in front of them. And I think that that's such an important and powerful tool in order to get other people to do the same thing. So I would start there.
I can see, Max, you wrote commercial feedlots. Do you want to speak to that about antibiotic resistance?
Oh, that was more, I think that this virus and everything that's kind of come from it has given a lot of great opportunities for people to kind of try out change. Some people might have some more time on their hands to maybe, set up a compost bin, or, with the meat shortage, it could be a great opportunity for people to try to reduce meat in their diet and look at some alternatives that they can maybe integrate into their daily life. And, there's a lot of information out there about how, maybe certain infections are related to livestock. Remember the swine flu back in near 2010, that was one. But there's information everywhere that you can find with a simple YouTube search that's talking about all the horrors of conventional agriculture. But, it's an interesting thing that maybe people will start to look into now that they can't eat meat as much as they want.
Yeah, and I would, as you mentioned, Keith, I believe the most, at least the data I've looked at, the most important driving factor for climate change is our agricultural system and the domestic livestock that we raise. So becoming a vegetarian or you're eating less meat is imperative for us to hit the climate, the warming that we want to protect ourselves from the most catastrophic harms of climate change. Taking action actually is a quantifiable measure of your impacts on the climate system, and there are a number of things that you can do. One of the most important things is speaking with other people in your community, just similar conversation to what we're having, but your family, your taxi driver. Then also taking action, attending rallies. I don't know how many million people were at Earth Day last year. And then there's also the fossil fuels that we use, electricity from coal-fired power plants or oil-fired power plants, gas, the use of automobiles. These are all other major driving factors. And I highly recommend, one of the most important things we can also do is educate ourselves about the emissions that we're producing. You can take your ecological footprint quiz and to be able to evaluate what in your life that you're doing is contributing to climate change and what in your life can you reduce. doing to minimize your effect on climate change.
Yes, and I find it not coincidental that we're celebrating 50th anniversary of Earth Day the year we're sheltering in place. I think it's striking in terms of timing, and it's very important that the link here is clear. I think the take-home message today was more species, less disease. Do what you can to support biodiversity. Look at Center for Biological Diversity. They have excellent data if you're not convinced. Early detection, fast removal. The giant Asian hornet is not a problem. You don't have to worry. Right here, it's too cold, so it's not going to be in your backyard tomorrow. The media may have portrayed it as such, but it's not. If you see a giant wasp, it's most likely not that. And if you're worried about it, join the citizen science revolution. Everybody, everywhere should be eco-literate with the use of applications like we've discussed, iNaturalist. So we take responsibility together. So in the areas, the areas where this giant hornet has been detected, if everyone was concerned about that and aware, but not afraid, and took notes, we could detect the places where it emerges and get rid of that. And here is the thing, that sounds counterintuitive. Why is she talking about killing hornets when she's talking about supporting biodiversity? The hornet is invasive. It will kill the local insects like bees. The most important pollinators are bees here, and honeybees, and we need to support them in any which way we can. So when we start thinking in terms of invasives and natives and healthy ecosystems, we are the global invasive species. and we must learn to coexist. That's the take-home message for me. In all of this, we must respect and understand our habitat, so to speak. And yes.
Can I comment on something that Max said and you said? So Max mentioned antibiotics, and I think this pandemic, and you said we are ecosystems, and I think we are ecosystems. So we are this conglomerate of viruses and bacteria, and this shelter in place pause that will be prolonged for a while really worries me, in the sense that our own ecosystem will be not exposed to different other people's bacteria, viruses, environments, parks. We are very lucky here that the parks will be reopening next week, hopefully, as they said, but not everyone is as lucky as we are here in Port. And what's gonna happen? Like this giant bee hornet will be a symbol of, you know, this sheltering in place invasiveness of isolation. So we don't give the opportunity of our own ecosystem to be rebalanced by interaction with other people. So these days, with Governor Cuomo announcing that we might adopt remote education for the rest of maybe the next years for our children. Everyone will be in isolation home, and he's remodeling this educational system with the idea that we can use technology and avoid buildings, avoid interaction. I think this is very disturbing in terms of what it means and what's the impact of my own ecosystem. And the life is changing. The life as we know it, like our inner microbiome is changing in the light of this epidemic. So I don't know, how do you see it?
So Hildur, I think this is a wonderful question, and it sort of will move us into a whole other discussion, and we're going to be closing in about 2 or 3 minutes. My question to you is, given the information that Adina has presented, or the question that she's presented, how do we get some answers to a lot of these questions, and where might we go to for more resources to really dig deep into the questions about, you know, how we're impacted, you know, how the inside is impacted by the outside and the outside impacts the inside, which is really kind of what we're talking about here in some way. Can you leave us with some words of wisdom?
I have a quick answer to this. There is really the place to go is nature. So we can support a healthy immune system and microbial health if you take to composting today. Wouldn't you agree, Paul? by actually starting the compost practice in your backyard that we have talked about in this class, and turning the compost, and you're touching earth. If we care about everything we consume, and instead of putting it in a plastic bag that's then sent to a landfill where it adds to the climate crisis, the global warming with emissions and other means, you're actually, if you're eating mindfully, what you eat is what you become healthy. If you're eating healthy, your waste doesn't leave your house. Your waste goes straight into the ground. I've talked about the depletion of topsoil. It's a significant problem. The UN predicts maybe 60 harvests left if we don't change our practices. How about everyone who's sheltering in place? That means all of us, the almost 8 billion people on earth right now. How about everyone who would take to practices of not disposing of their waste in plastic bags, but rather eating mindfully and becoming sustainable right where you're at, disposing of your waste responsibly. And if we're leaning towards vegetarianism or trying to avoid meat waste, there will be very little waste going from your house that's not, you know, you will be able to compost most of what you consume, right? The leftovers. And on that note, zero waste in any which way you can. Plastic is already a big problem. So by simply minding my consumption and interacting with the natural world, it's less important that I'm interacting in person. If I can meet my social thirst for your company right here, right now, I feel very inspired to connect in this way. And yes, the time will come if we help contribute to a healthy ecosystem right where we're at. The time will come that we can hold hands and hug and take walks together in person. But we must be responsible, and we must start today.
So Hildur, this has been, you know, really so wonderful, because it's the tip of the iceberg, right? We could really get into this so much more. And I'm wondering, for those people who are not here on the call, but those people who might have spoken up in the call, how would people who are watching get a hold of you or the other folks that are here to go ahead and sort of dive into these questions a little bit more? What websites and what links and what emails, perhaps? Tell us a little bit more.
Please email me at hildur@soulcenter. So hildur@sol.center, or join rewildlongisland.org. We have a thriving email list, so you can go to rewildlongisland.org website and join us simply as an interested. It's at no cost to become part of our community. Also, Transition Towns, Port Washington. Paul is with me in that effort. Transition Town, Port Washington is a group of concerned citizens. It's a civic organization of sorts. Its only goal is to educate one another.
Great. And I know one of the questions that came up was about bionomes and the whole idea of how what we put in our body and how we interact with each other. helps normalize a lot of what's going on. So I guess we would find out a little bit more about that as well if we go to one of the sites and get more information. So, yeah.
Or both Transition Town, Port Washington Network. You can find Transition Town, Port Washington on Facebook, for example, if you're on Facebook, or rewildlongisland.org, or simply email me and we will connect you with. We're all learning together. It's an experience, and it's fun to do it together. It's scary to do it alone. And I find there is strength in numbers, and it's an incredibly rich and nurturing friendship that's now really solidifying these intentions to live sustainably in any which way we can. So
Great. Thank you so much, Hildur. And we'll see you all next week at another episode of Your Environment Now, and real good information. And I hope you have a great day and make your environment wonderful. All right.